Hi, this is Peter Beal, and in this screencast I want to talk a little bit about the ideas of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism as they begin to emerge in French art in particular in the 1860s and middle 1870s, and see the sort of progression of these styles up until about roughly 1890, more or less. That I think will cover really the the end of the course, the end of the semester, really. To begin with, we want to just recap briefly some of the artistic movements that occurred in the previous decades, in particular the movements known as realism and romanticism. In romanticism, we see a great deal of emphasis on human emotion and human freedom, the sense of escaping the confines of social and political structures is a paramount concern of the Romantic artists and writers. Certainly, I think, though, by the time, say, of 1830, that's probably a good way to put some sort of cutoff date. By about 1830, the ideas of Romanticism had more or less begun to dry up as sources for, I guess, what we might describe as a genuine or authentic art movement. And increasingly, artists are casting around for different options. And one of these options that's quite popular, besides the reliable academic modes of painting that have been popular now for a number of years, especially found in the neoclassical style, one of the most popular options was the style known as realism. And we talked a little bit about Gustave Courbet and his emphasis on this kind of unflinching, very straight depiction of situations in especially economic or social structures that clearly were a problem. Now, realism, which was prompted in part by the invention of photography in 1839, realism itself began to run into issues too. I think probably by about 1860 or so. The sense was that this was no longer a satisfying option, as it, in a sense, removed the idea of artistic agency from anything but a kind of, the artist as a social commentator, or almost like a politician or an orator. I mean, the idea of any artistic or aesthetic intention being at the heart of say, a painting is really hard to find in realism. And so there was a need, I think, for the presence of the artist to be felt. That it could be, there could be a role essentially for the actual artist on an aesthetic level. And therefore, by roughly the mid 1860s, increasingly artists are looking for ways to restore to painting this sense of aesthetic involvement. And they're also, and this may have something to do with contemporary political events, particularly the war with Prussia in 1870-1871 in France. There's perhaps also a general desire perhaps to leave contemporary events alone for a while. The idea of, again, Prussia, then a kind of civil war or uprising in Paris. It's a very difficult time for the nation of France, and obviously for artists within that within that setting. So the sense of escape is also, I think, present. So it's a kind of, what's going to happen is a kind of contemporary escape. In other words, an escape into a new kind of art that focuses on relatively pleasing, light-hearted subjects, relatively neutral subjects, where the opportunity of the artist to make an impact is most easily felt in the artist's handling of light and color. And there is, of course, the problem of making one's identity known, or publicizing, in essence, one's ideas about art in the context of that relatively repressive academic salon environment. what's interesting is that artists begin to react to this by forming essentially a group, a kind of society or club that will come to be known as the Impressionists. And their first exhibition is in April of 1874. And the painting that we're looking at now, Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, dating from 1872, was one of the paintings singled out for criticism by people who were skeptical essentially about this new style, and derided as Impressionism. Impressionism or Impressionists were seen as suspect, not willing to or able to put in the requisite amount of effort and labor and skill and industry to create a properly finished picture. There's little doubt that at the time these types of pictures, these paintings, were seen as a real alternative direction, to put it as neutrally as possible. To some people, they represented a degradation of the European painting tradition because they were so unfinished. And in Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, again 1872, we see a harbor scene, and harbor scenes are not really that original per se. I mean, there have been many painters in the 19th century, and we could go back to the likes of Claude Lorrain, for instance, who had harbor scenes as a really important part of his style of painting, the way that he worked. Monet creates a scene of Le Havre, a very important French shipping port, with a bare minimum of means. He presents the viewer with the overall, again, a kind of the idea of impression is quite appropriate here, a sense of the scene filtered through the ideas of light and color. In other words, we're not really allowed to distinguish any specific forms. There's no closely rendered detail, for instance, that makes it easy to say for sure exactly what the various elements, forms in the picture are. There's also a very strong reliance on the effects of color. So in a sort of dawn atmosphere in a harbor, we really would expect to see the overall scene governed by the interaction of the low position of the sun and a great deal of atmosphere, mist and pollution and what have you. The effect, in other words, of looking at the painting is intended to be the same as the effect of looking not at the ships or the specific behavior of the light in the water, but this kind of overall ambience or environment that's beheld at a glance, that's constantly changing, that's constantly shifting. So there you see, I think, in Monet's Impression Sunrise, that where the idea of the impression comes from. Now, what does this mean? I mean, this is a very neutral painting in a lot of ways. It doesn't seem to carry much in the way of content or a message to the viewer. I think that I would suggest that you consider the painting in the context of change and fragmentation, even disintegration, not just of an artistic consensus, but also of visual reality itself. More and more people are looking at the world, and especially this contemporary new idea of the world and the modern world, as a phenomenon that is under constant flux or change. And photography, for instance, if we consider photography for a second, photography captures slices of that constantly changing world, but does it in a very kind of discrete and sort of chunked way. They're going to be, even in the photographs of Edward Muybridge, say horses galloping, you have this sense of discrete individual slices of time being captured with no clear bridge between them. And the Impressionist achievement, in I think many ways one of the most important achievements of the Impressionists, was to present to the viewer that sense of flow and transition in a given image or a given painting between different states of time. In other words, we see in the work of the Impressionist his attempting to fuse together, but without artificially kind of welding together, but fuse together these blended moments of time that drift in and out of our perception, I guess is the best way of putting it. So in a sense, that very cursory and almost abstract handling of paint, the refusal to set anything down in any final sense, is an acknowledgement of this rapid transfer, this shift of time. And of course, time as expressed through the changes in light and color and ultimately activity too. For instance, we have to remember that many Impressionists will paint the streets of Paris or other very transitory types of subject matter. How does Monet do this? He is a great proponent of the practice of painting in plein air, in other words, in the open. The artist is absorbed in the environment, in essence living out the act of painting. It isn't remote or confined to the studio. And by being in the environment, the artist takes a kind of almost subconscious note or memory of everything that's going on to help provide this overall sense, this overall impression. It's not strictly speaking photographic, despite some of the advice that Monet gives, that one should try to see with a naive impression, a kind of unmediated or unlearned eye. It is a more like a collage of say, 1 million photographs, all taken right around the same time, but from slightly different viewpoints, from slightly different times. And we're left, as I said, with a kind of fusing of all these different times and all these different perceptions. This kind of shimmering and vibrating and constantly changing view that really requires the viewer's active participation to make it work. Little wonder, given the priorities of the academic art community on permanence and stability and order, little wonder that the Impressionists found a somewhat hostile reception in Paris in 1874.